Iran relations, Iran's nuclear deal. It's by me. This is some of my credentials as to who I am. And I'll talk about it briefly once everybody is here. And this is what we're going to be talking about today. This is the presentation outline. I'll talk about the Iran deal in terms of the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and currently the Biden administration. So how's everybody doing? Getting ready for the winter. You can see that the weather is starting to change, slightly. The nights are much nicer to sleep now. From that perspective, that's good. I gave a talk last night at the Longmeadow Adult Center on the Ukraine situation up to the present time, which is really timely if you've been following the news at all, because of the attack that occurred on the Russian Kerch Bridge and the subsequent follow-up retaliation by President Putin as far as missile attack and drone attacks in various cities throughout Ukraine. So that's really heating up as, what's next? I mean, is it going to get to the point where it could possibly end up leading to some type of a nuclear confrontation? Because that's what President Putin is threatening based on NATO and U.S. continued support, of Ukraine. And Ukraine has gone on an offensive counter operations right now, which is really impacting on Russia's ability to be able to hold on to the territory that they've sieged so far, to include Crimea. So that was a very interesting talk. And maybe next month I'll give the talk here as well.
Is he just threatening Ukraine or all the world?
Well, he's threatening Ukraine, but obviously if he ended up using a tactical nuclear weapon, I mean, it's going to draw in Europe, it's going to draw in the United States as well.
Were things quieter before they blew up the bridge?
I would say it was probably at a standstill, especially with the winter months coming in. And in all likelihood, Russia was going to go into a defensive posture along the eastern border, those four territories or provinces that they annexed. Ukraine would try to, take back as much of that territory as they could. But by the December timeframe, the winter months are going to set in, and it's going to really slow down any military operations. And I wouldn't even be surprised if you saw a ceasefire. And if that occurred, then there wouldn't be any military action until probably the spring timeframe, which would probably be about March of next year.
Did Ukraine accomplish anything by blowing up that bridge?
Well, they haven't claimed that they did it yet. I was reading on the news this morning that the Russian authorities has apprehended 5 or 6 individuals that they see are responsible for it. It was interesting. 3 of them were Russian, and the other 2 were either Ukrainian or Armenian. So there's a whole story behind, what's that all about. I mean, same thing with the pipelines that were attacked up in the North Sea, the Russian pipelines. Did the Russians do it, or did Ukraine do it, or did the Chinese do it? They don't really know. They're investigating that. But that was an interesting presentation, and I'll bring it here to the center as well, and obviously I'll update it as to what's currently going on. So, but today we're here to talk about the Iran nuclear deal, and I always like to kind of start the presentation off with a kind of a map or maps, kind of putting the situation into perspective. Now, this map here is a map of the Middle East, a region of the world. And generally, when people think of the Middle East, they think of Saudi Arabia and Iran and Turkey. But they failed to realize that the Middle East includes the northern part of Africa. It includes countries like Egypt, Libya, Algeria, Morocco, for example. So when we're talking about the Middle East, we're talking about North Africa. Obviously, you have the countries in the Arabian Peninsula. You have the Middle East that's generally referred to in terms of Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq. And then you have what's generally referred to as the two empire states of Iran and Turkey, meaning ancient civilization, the Ottoman Empire, for example, the Persian Empire. And then more recently, you have Turkestan, which is 5 of the former Soviet republics that declared their independence. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, it broke up into 15 republics. And 5 of those countries are in what's generally referred to as Central Asia. And these are Islamic-type countries like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, for example. But this is what we mean by the Middle East. Now, this chart here focuses on what we're going to be talking about today, the country of Iran. And if you follow history at all, especially in the 20th century, Iran, along with Iraq, has always had a very, very strong desire to be the ruling power within the region, especially as far as the Middle East goes. If you recall, in the 1980s timeframe, there was a major war between Iraq and Iran, and it was really a power struggle as to who was going to have the bigger footprint within this part of the world. Now, this chart here shows basically Iran from a nuclear power perspective. This is what their nuclear power structure or organization within the country looked at the time that the peace deal was negotiated in 2015. And as you look at it, you can really see that it had a very, very extensive nuclear power program that raised a lot of concern that it wasn't just for the generation of nuclear power for peaceful purposes, but also the development of a nuclear weapons program. And probably the 2 facilities that were in, that was leading that movement was Fordow, which is located here. They did work on enriching uranium that's needed to make a nuclear weapon. And also Kastens, which is also another facility that does extensive uranium enrichment as well. And these are probably the 2 major plants or facilities at the time of the 2015 deal that were doing most of the Iran nuclear work. So having put that in sort of in the context as to where we are in the world and what we're talking about, this is what we'll be talking about over probably the next 20 minutes or so. Let me begin my talk by asking the question, what was the name of Iran before 1935? Anybody know? Yes? Persia. Persia, exactly. The answer is Persia. In 1935, the Iranian government requested those countries having diplomatic ties with Persia to begin calling the country Iran, which is the name of the country in Persian, in the Persian language. One reason for the name change was to establish Iran as its own country, no longer under the foreign influence of Great Britain or Russia. Over time, the international community embraced the name change, and today, the country's official name is the Islamic Republic of Iran. In 1953, a coup d'etat overturned the constitutional monarchy that was established in 1905 and set up an autocratic rule under Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, generally referred to as the Shah of Iran. Widespread dissatisfaction with the Shah and Western influence, especially from the United States, led to the Iran Revolution in 1979. Shah Pahlavi fled to the United States, and the U.S. Embassy in Tehran was overrun with 52 Americans held hostage for 444 days. They were held hostage until January 1981. Again, if you follow history at all, during the time that Jimmy Carter was in office, he tried to get the hostages free, but he failed in at least one attempt. And the Iranians decided that they were not going to negotiate with him, and they didn't until President Reagan came in. And that was one of the first things that happened during the Reagan administration, the freeing of the hostages. This marked the beginning of hostile relations between the United States and Iran that continues to the present day. During the Iran Revolution, Ruhollah Khomeini returned to Iran. He was a religious cleric with a very, very strong influence in Iran. And he formed in 1979 what was called a theocracy. A theocracy is where the political leader of the country is also the religious leader of the country. So even though Iran does in fact elect a president, the real power of the country is not in the hands of the president, but really in the religious leader, who's generally referred to as the Ayatollah. Can anybody offhand think of another theocracy where the religious leader is also the political leader of the country? The Roman Catholic Church, the Vatican. The Vatican is a recognized country by the United Nations, and Pope Francis is currently the political leader of the Vatican City and also the religious leader of the Roman Catholic Church. That would be another example. So I want to, and the reason why I make that point, sometimes people will say, well, we'll associate a negative connotation to the idea of a theocracy, and that's not necessarily true. You can have a religious leader who's a political leader of the country and still be looking out for the general welfare of the country. In the 1990s, the 80s were marked by the Iran-Iraq war that I mentioned when I was showing you the maps, where Iraq was hoping to replace Iran as the power player in the Persian Gulf region. And Iraq also had fears that the Iran Revolution would spill over to Iraq, leading to a Sunni Shiite conflict. Again, if you know anything about the Islamic religion, there's two strong factions within the religion. It's the Sunni faction, and the Shiite factions goes all the way back to the death of Muhammad in 632 AD. And there has been, at that time, a religious conflict between the two factions that over the decades or centuries really manifests itself more into a political conflict. The U.S.-Iran relations continued to deteriorate after the Iran Revolution in 1979, and it focused on basically three areas: U.S. refusal to return the Shah to Iran for prosecution, Iran's refusal to return the American hostages from the U.S. Embassy, which didn't occur, like I said, until January 81, and growing international concern over Iran's nuclear power program and Iran's destabilizing influence in the Middle East. Again, it was jockeying along with Iraq for a stronger influence within the Middle East region. Iran's nuclear program started in the in the 1950s with the help of the U.S. under the Atoms for Peace program. In 1970, Iran was a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, called the NPT, which limited nuclear power to peaceful uses subject to international atomic energy inspections, generally referred to as the IAEA. And under the NPT, basically meant that countries could pursue nuclear power for peaceful purposes like research and also commercial power, but it could not use it to pursue a nuclear weapons capability. Matter of fact, the only countries at the time that the NPT recognized were 5 nuclear powers. Anybody know who the 5 nuclear powers were at the time? I bet you didn't realize you were going to be tested here. Okay, one certainly is the United States.
Was India?
No, and not, well, India has a nuclear weapons capability right now, but it's not a signatory to the NPT. Same thing with Pakistan. But the nuclear powers at the time was the United States, Russia, France, UK, and the 5th one was China. And that'll have an impact as far as the nuclear deal goes, and I'll mention that later on. After the 1979 Iran revolution, Iran continued to work on the uranium enrichment program, but on a clandestine basis. In 2003, the IAEA, again, the International Atomic Energy Agency, I'll mention it a number of times during the presentation, became aware of undeclared nuclear activities and launched an investigation leading to the United Nations Security Council demanding Iran suspend its nuclear program. In November 2011, IAEA reported that Iran's program also had included nuclear weapon design work. Despite the UN mandate, United Nations mandate, the international community was still concerned that Iran was continuing to work on its nuclear power program. The election of Iranian Hassan Rouhani in 2013 led to discussions to negotiate a comprehensive nuclear power deal which would allow Iran to pursue a nuclear power program for peaceful purposes and would allow, it would provide relief to Iran from international sanctions that were imposed because of its ongoing program. The deal was called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Jcpoa, which was completed on July 14th, 2015, and implemented on January 16th, 2016. Signatories to the Jcpoa were Iran and what's generally referred to as the P5+1. The countries included the United States, the UK, France, Russia, and China, all the nuclear power countries, all permanent members of the Security Council, and the last country was Germany as well. So that was generally what's referred to as the P5+1. Now, key provisions of the Jcpoa included the following. First, the sunset provisions, which restricted, under the deal, Iranian to producing uranium only to the 3.6% level needed for research work and commercial power uses, while maintaining a uranium stockpile of only 300 kilograms, or approximately 660 pounds. It also restricted heavy water nuclear reactor construction and heavy water accumulation, all activities that could lead to the refinement of uranium to the level of being able to use it to make a nuclear weapon. These instructions, or these restrictions, were in place for 15 years, that is until 2031. That's why it's referred to as the sunset provision, and it's also considered one of the Achilles heels of the deal, is because it limited just how long, or it did not put a long-term restriction on when Ukraine, when Iran could start producing higher grades of uranium. It also restricted the type and number of centrifuges that Iran could use to enrich uranium. This restriction was in place for 10 years, that is, until 2026. As far as inspections and verification went, Iran had up to 24 days advance notice, requiring 24 days of advance notice to allow the IAEA to make inspections. And military facilities were also excluded from the inspections, which mean Iran technically speaking, in those areas not designated subject to inspections, like military installations, could in fact carry on nuclear activities without an IAEA inspection. The Jcpoa included a snapback provision to reimpose all sanctions if Iran violated the terms of the deal. For example, if Iran started to produce more than uranium to a higher grade than 3.6%, that would be a violation. And under the snapback provisions, then all the sanctions that were imposed and lifted at the start of the deal could be reimposed. The deal compliance by Iran gave relief from economic sanctions, which were obviously very, very important to Iran, access to foreign assets, and included increasing oil exports from Iran. Iran, I think, is the second or third largest producer of the OPEC organization, cartel, the Organization for Petroleum Exporting Countries, which provides probably 30 to 40% of the world's supply of oil. The United Nations, the UN, also passed UN Resolution 2231, which restricted conventional weapon sales to Iran for 5 years, that is until 2020. Note, U.S. made a motion to the UN Security Council in October 2020 to extend the weapon sales embargo, but it was not passed. It was vetoed in the Security Council. It also restricted Iran's testing of ballistic missiles capable of delivering nuclear weapons for 8 years, that is, until 2023. Under the provisions, Iran could do ballistic testing, but it was only supposed to be with missiles that had a conventional weapons capability. But you quickly find out that if you can develop a ballistic missile that has a conventional weapon capability, it can be very, very easily converted to a nuclear weapons capability as well. So it's really, one of the Achilles heel of the deal, in that it really gave Iran a lot of latitude as far as ballistic missile testing went. The Obama administration requested congressional approval of the Jcpoa, but was unable to get the votes to pass it. Major congressional concerns at the time is that Iran could not be trusted to live up to the terms of the deal, and the deal was not a long-term solution to the Ukrainian nuclear ambitions. President Obama decided to go ahead with the deal without congressional approval, so it really, in essence, made it an executive order on his part, because he felt that the deal would contain Iran's nuclear weapons ambition in the near term, that is at least to 2031, and would open the door to more diplomatic talks in the future. The P5+1 felt that it was the best deal that could be negotiated at the time. In January 2017, the Trump In 2017, the Trump administration took over the White House and initially certified that Iran was meeting the terms of the Jcpoa. By 2018, the Trump administration had reassessed the deal and decided that the deal was not comprehensive enough and needed to be renegotiated for the following reasons. One, the sunset provisions that I mentioned earlier didn't stop Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. It just kicked the problem down the road for 15 years for another administration, to worry about. Two, the IAEA inspections and verifications should be conducted anytime, anywhere, unannounced, and should include military facilities. The idea of being required to give Iran 24-day advance notice before an inspection took place just didn't seem to make sense. It really did give Iran an awful lot of time to sort of cover its tracks, so to speak. And again, it did not include military facilities, which the Trump administration thought should. Advanced notification can lead to potential clandestine nuclear activities. Three, the Jcpoa closed IAEA probes into documented nuclear weapon efforts. It was known that in the past, prior to the deal, that Iran was in fact doing not only nuclear power research, but also nuclear weapon design work as well. And the Jcpoa did not provide any provisions for the IAEA to look into those type of activities. Iran, like I said earlier, Iran was also conducting ballistic missile testing at the time, which many of the Western powers felt could include missile testing that had a nuclear weapon capability. There is no way of monitoring that type of testing, and again, the Trump administration felt that there was a need for it. The Jcpoa also didn't address other areas of concern as far as Iran goes. For example, Iran's destabilizing the role in the Middle East in countries like Syria and Yemen. Iran's sponsorship of terrorist activities and organizations in the Middle East like Hamas and Hezbollah, or the Houthi rebels in Yemen, and a currently ongoing situation in the Middle East. The Trump administration's strategy was to use economic sanctions to get Iran to renegotiate the deal. President Trump reached out to the other P5+1 countries to add their own sanctions or to keep in place their sanctions prior to the deal. But there was reluctance to lead the deal, but he failed because they were just reluctant to lead the deal because they thought that it was the best possible at the time. The Trump administration did not agree with that. On May 8th of 2018, the U.S. unilaterally withdrew from the Jcpoa, and foreign countries and companies who were in Iran at the time were given 180 days to wind down business, any business arrangement that they had with Iran, and if they did not, then they could possibly face U.S. sanctions as well. Because as far as the U.S. was concerned at the time, the sanctions were equally applicable to any country or company that was likewise doing business with Iran at the time. On October 6, 2018, the U.S. imposed sanctions on Iran's financial institutions and organizations. On November 4, 2018, the U.S. imposed sanctions on Iran's oil and shipping sector, with oil exemptions given to 8 countries for a 6-month period to find new sources of oil. These 8 countries, by the way, they were China, India, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Turkey, Italy, and Greece. These countries had a heavy reliance on Ukrainian oil. And so the Trump administration decided to give them 6 months to find new sources. Yes?
Iranian oil.
Huh?
That's Iranian.
Iranian oil.
You said Ukrainian.
Okay, I'm sorry, Iranian oil. I'm still in the Ukraine presentation mode from last night. Note, in January 2018, Israeli Mossad, which is kind of similar to our CIA organization, conducted a covert operation in Iran that raided a secret Iranian nuclear archive, first discovered in February 2016, showing that Iran had done extensive research work in nuclear weapon concepts and design work. The IAEA also concluded that Iran was actively designing a nuclear weapon through at least 2009. Initially, Iran exercised kind of a laid-back approach in the first year of the U.S. withdrawal from the Jcpoa. Iran worked with the other P5+1 members to get the U.S. to rejoin the Jcpoa. Iran also avoided targeting U.S. and European assets, but they did attack Saudi Arabia assets because they likewise were an indirect party to the Jcpoa. President Trump's decision in April 2019 to not extend the 8-country oil exemption pushed Iran to a more confrontational strategy designed to raise the fear of war with major disruptions to the global oil supply network. Iranian President Rouhani launched the strategy with a speech on May 8, 2019, warning that Iran would be willing to walk away from the Jcpoa within 60 days if the U.S. did not rejoin the deal. Following President Rouhani's speech, several terrorist attacks occurred. On May 12, 2019, Saudi oil tankers were attacked in the Gulf of Oman. On May 14, 2019, a Saudi oil pipeline was attacked by the Houthi rebels. They fired a drone at the oil fields, at the pipeline. On June 14, 2019, Japan-bound oil tankers were attacked in the Strait of Hormuz. No, Iran disavowed any responsibility for these attacks. The U.S. responded to these terrorist attacks by increasing its military surveillance and protection in the Middle East. On June 20, 2019, Iran destroyed an American air drone in the Persian Gulf, claiming it had entered Iranian airspace. President Trump at the time decided not to use force in responding to this direct attack by Iran. Instead, he increased economic sanctions on key Iranian leadership, launched a cyber attack on Iranian missile networks and military intelligence groups, and established a U.S. international maritime security coalition for the Persian Gulf. In July 2019, Iran moved away from the Jcpoa, claiming U.S. withdrawal from the Jcpoa gave Iran the right to move forward with its nuclear power program by stockpiling enriched uranium beyond Jcpoa limits and enriching uranium beyond Jcpoa limits using advanced centrifuges. On November 11, 2019, an IAEA report attested to Iran exceeding the Jcpoa limits. The last year of the Trump administration, that is 2020, did little to resolve the Jcpoa deal. U.S. economic sanctions remained in place. The other P5+1 members tried to get the U.S. to rejoin, and Iran continued to enrich uranium and increase its uranium stockpile, especially after Iran's top military leader, if you recall, back in 2020, Qasem Soleimani, was killed by a U.S. drone attack in Iraq. At that time, Iran indicated that they would now start enriching uranium up to, I think, 20%, well beyond the 3.6% authorized by the deal, or permitted by the deal. In January 2021, the Biden administration took over the White House and embarked on a new initiative to get the Jcpoa back on track with the U.S. rejoining the deal and Iran returning to strict Jcpoa compliance. The initiative started in April 2021 with its first meeting held in Vienna, Austria. This meeting started with Iran making several demands that had to be met if negotiations were to move forward. One, all economic sanctions imposed by the U.S. must be lifted. Two, removal of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, that is the IRGC, from the U.S. designated terrorist list, which was done under the Trump administration in 2019. Iran also wanted a guarantee that future U.S. administrations would not renege on the deal as the Trump administration did in 2018. And fourth, the IAEA would end its investigation into undeclared nuclear activities at 3 Iranian sites showing the presence of uranium particles that were discovered in 2019. This demand is actually outside the scope of the Jcpoa, but it was just one more demand that Iran was making that made negotiations that much more difficult. This is clearly an IAEA issue under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Note, as of this date, the Biden administration has not agreed to the first 3 demands and has deferred the last demand to IAEA, who will not end the investigation until such time that Iran provides satisfactory explanation as to why there were traces of uranium particles in these 3 undeclared sites in Iran. A total of 8 meetings have been held, ending in March 2022 this year, with no firm results achieved. Indirect talks were held in late June, to be exact, the 28th and the 29th, in Doha, Qatar, with little progress made. Another indirect talk was held in early August, the 4th through the 8th, in Vienna, Austria, at which time the European Chief Coordinator, Josep Borrell, provided the U.S. and Iran with a final draft on the revised Jcpoa deal. On September 14, 2022, Chief Coordinator Borrell said that both sides were converging towards a deal, but Iran's latest proposal was not helping. A few days earlier, at September 10, 2022, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said a deal is unlikely in the near term, citing Iran's unwillingness or inability to do what's necessary to reach an agreement. Other events impacting negotiations during this time included assassination threats on President Trump's national security advisor, John Bolton, which was in fact foiled by, I believe, the U.S. FBI. Also threats on Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and U.S.-Iran envoy Brian Hook, as well as Iranian author Salman Rushdie, who remains subject to a death sentence Iran imposed in 1989 over his book, The Saltic Verses, which attacked the Islamic religion. On June 8, 2022, the IAEA adopted a resolution submitted by the UK, France, Germany, and the US that condemned Iran for its undeclared nuclear activities in 2019. Iran responded by removing 27 surveillance cameras at the various nuclear facilities in Iran, making it much more difficult for the IAEA to monitor Iran's nuclear activities. Iran officials made public announcements as early as July 2022, just a couple of months ago, that Iran's nuclear enrichment efforts are approaching nuclear weapon-grade material. Currently, Iran is enriching uranium to 60% and has developed the technical ability to make an atomic bomb. An Iranian online video was also released saying that Iran's ballistic missiles could turn New York into a heap of rubble from hell. These actions are not indicative of a country wanting nuclear power for solely peaceful purposes. The U.S. Congress is also playing a role in the negotiations. In 2015, the U.S. Congress passed the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act, requiring congressional review of any future Iranian nuclear deal, which must be submitted to the Congress within 5 days after deal completion. The U.S. Congress then has 30 days to review the deal and either approve or not approve the deal. So where are we today? First, let me be clear. Under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, Iran does have the right to pursue a nuclear power program for peaceful purposes. However, Iran cannot use the program to develop a nuclear weapons capability. Currently, Iran is enriching uranium to the 60% level. Nuclear grade level is 90%. And Iran has also accumulated a uranium stockpile of 3,800 kilograms or 837 pounds, which is sufficient material to make one nuclear bomb. The obvious question is, why is Iran doing this if it has no intention to develop a nuclear weapons capability? Could it be to increase Iran's bargaining power at the negotiating table to get economic sanction lifted? Or possibly is Iran following in the footsteps of North Korea and recognizing that possessing a nuclear weapon capability gives a country leverage that it would not otherwise have? Or possibly Iran has aspired to be the superpower in the Middle East with a nuclear weapons capability. We are in the middle of a power struggle right now between Iran and the U.S. in light of Iran's noncompliance with the Jcpoa provisions. The question is, based on what I mentioned earlier, as far as their enrichment program goes, and the amount and the size of their stockpile, will in fact the snapback provisions within the Jcpoa eventually be imposed? And if so, what will or how will Iran react to that? If you look at what's happened in the past, they've just escalated their ability to develop a nuclear weapons capability. There is also an elephant in the room that nobody wants to talk about. And it's not the question of Iran getting a nuclear power program that could be weaponized. It is the question of nuclear weapon proliferation. Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt, possibly other Middle Eastern countries like Jordan, will not idly stand by if Iran does develop a nuclear power, parentheses, weapons capability, nor will Israel for that matter. How long will it take for nuclear weapon technology and materials to fall into the hands of terrorist organizations like ISIS or Al-Qaeda, or Hamas or Hezbollah, which would be a direct threat to Israel? There is also a wild card in this poker game, and it is Israel, who has sworn that Iran will not be allowed to develop a nuclear weapons capability. Note, Iran's Natanz nuclear facility that I showed you on the chart was sabotaged in July 2020. and Iran's top research scientist, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, was assassinated in November 2020. Iran alleges that Israel was behind both these instances. This concludes my presentation. I'd be more happy to answer any questions that you may have. Yes?
Okay, I was thinking that sanctions wouldn't really hurt Iran if it was only the U.S. and not the rest of the world. But the way Iran is complaining about it and bargaining to get it lifted, it sounds like it really is hurting them. Is that?
And that's true. And the reason why is not just because of the standalone economic power of the United States, but the United States has extended those sanctions to any other country around the world, not only countries but companies that do in fact do business with Iran. And so that ends up almost making it a global sanction, not just a U.S. I mean, you know, the United States is still economically, you know, the most powerful country economically, and you have a choice between doing business with the United States or doing business with Iran, which could be your choice, you know, United States. So that's the big Achilles heel. And that's what Iran wants most, not so much the ability to have nuclear weapons. They want the economic sanction listed because it is, in fact, decimating their economy and raising a lot of social unrest. For example, there's a major social unrest going on in the country, you know, right now.
So was it ever believable that one of the great oil powers would care about nuclear energy? Would want to try to get that?
I mean, you would certainly make that argument. I mean, you know, I think they're the second or third largest country in OPEC. And so it raises the question, did they really want it for peaceful purposes, or did they really want it to be able to develop a nuclear weapons capability that would give them a significant amount of power within the Middle East countries? And if you follow along, that's sort of been their aspirations going back, you know, to the 1970s, 80s time frame. Any other questions? The only, you know, I'm a college professor, and I used to always kid with my students because, especially with freshmen, they were always kind of timid to ask questions. And I said, don't be afraid to ask a question. The only dumb question is the question not asked. You know, and they used to always chuckle, but I'd always get a couple more responses after, you know, questions after that, because they realize, yeah, there's no reason not to ask a question. Yes?
I have a question about the social unrest that seems to be ongoing now, related to that young woman who was murdered in police custody, and it just seems like it's not ending. And how does that impact the government and, you know, their stability there, because it is widespread?
It all depends on how the rest of the world reacts to it. Take, for example, this is not the first time this happened. I think during the Obama administration, there was what's referred to as the Green Revolution at the time, where there was across the country, not just in Tehran, a major uprising. And the U.S. was asked to intercede, you know, and help, you know, support the movement, but the Obama administration decided at the time that they just didn't want to do it. Part of the reason is because they were hoping to complete negotiations for the Jcpoa. And now it's happening again under the, during the Biden administration. And so far, again, there's been sort of a hands-off attitude, even though there's been, you know, an international condemnation of what happened, but no action has really been taken, due in part again because they're trying to renegotiate the deal. And the reason why it's so important, especially to the U.S., if the deal can be renegotiated or the U.S. rejoins it and lifts economic sanctions, then Iran can start exporting more oil to the rest of the world, probably in the tune of maybe 100, maybe a million to 2 million barrels per day. And again, that plays into their hand. You know, a lot of times you see things like this happening, you know, you really got to look behind the scenes as to why governments seem to be hesitant, you know, to really intercede and come, you know, to the rescue of the Iranian people when you see tragedies like this happening. Karen, you always have a question.
I know you'd say that.
You have the stage.
Poor Karen, what's for supper?
Just remember, make me look good.
All right. Are there any other countries that are interested in supporting the insurrection there in Iran?
So far, the international community has taken note of it, condemned it. It's been brought before the United Nations as far as their human rights committee, but there's been no action so far as far as follow-up. You know, the countries that can really do it, the European countries, the U.S., you know, are currently involved in the renegotiating of the plan. Matter of fact, besides the G5+1, it's actually been expanded to include the European Union. And the European Union, I think, includes 27 of the major European countries as well. So internationally speaking, there hasn't been the uproar that you would expect, especially considering that the woman, you know, was killed simply because she didn't want to wear, I guess, a headband or the dress.
How would they interrupt, I mean, get involved to correct that?
How's that?
How would they get involved if the country wanted to help out?
Economic sanctions. The UN, you know, part of these sanctions that are on Iran were not only U.S. and European sanctions, but also UN sanctions as well.
Would that hurt the people that are uprising there, the sanctions?
The argument that's made that in the short term, yes, but if it brings about regime change, or it brings about a better human rights, you know, protection, then in the long run, it's you know, it's worth it. That's the general argument that's used. But you'll find that in order for economic sanctions to really work, at least global economic sanctions, it really requires that everybody abides by the sanctions, and that never happens. I mean, take the Ukraine situation. There's been extensive global, you know, economic sanctions brought against Russia to try to force them to negotiate and eventually leave Ukraine. And they've been relatively unsuccessful, if you think about it, because the war continues. And one of the major reasons for it is because you've got countries like China and India, two of the largest economies in the world, that are still doing business with Iran, with Russia, to include buying their oil. Matter of fact, earlier I was talking about the sabotage of the Nord Stream #1 and #2 pipelines. One of the possibilities is that it was deliberately done not by Russia, not by Ukraine, not by Europe, but by China. You say, well, why would China want to do it? Well, if China, can shut down both lines, which means in the future, if Russia wanted to, pull back or reestablish, contracts with Europe, because currently, or at least up until just the last few months, they were importing about 30%. 30% of the oil was coming from Russia. Even more in the case of Germany. I think Germany is 50-60%. And so if those pipelines have been sabotaged or no longer serviceable, who do you think Russia is going to sell all that petroleum to? To China. There's an investigation currently underway to determine who was cause for it. So there's a lot of characters involved. Same thing with the Kerch Bridge. Was it Ukraine? Ukraine so far hasn't said that it was them. They're now finding that it could be Russians, who basically because they want the war to end, because they don't want to be constricted into the Russian army. Yes.
In your opinion, do you think Jcpoa was a good deal? I mean, it was negotiated under Obama, and then Trump backed out. What's your own opinion?
I don't think that it was a good deal. I think it was too narrow in scope, and and it was too time limited. Basically, what the deal did, it didn't resolve the problem, just kicked it down the road for 15 years for another administration, for another renegotiation. But during that time, Iran was moving towards a nuclear weapons capability. That's what happened in North Korea. Basically, going into the 1990s, the U.S. continually negotiated with North Korea with the threat of economic sanctions and embargoes and so forth. And they just continued to negotiate, stonewall them, and eventually what happened? They had their nuclear weapons capability. Besides the fact that they just kicked it down down the road, there was other major shortfalls within the deal as well. I mean, how can you have a true inspection as to whether or not they're complying when they have 24 advance notice? And they specify, what facilities you can and can't go in, like you can't go in military facilities. And then there was the concern over the ballistic missile testing. It was so loosely defined that Iran could argue that they were developing or testing ballistic missiles that only carried conventional weapons that can very, very easily be modified to have a nuclear weapons capability. And probably the big Achilles heel, sir, I bet you're sorry you asked the question. The big Achilles heel, I think, was the fact that Iran was really exerting itself in a lot of different parts of the Middle East, creating political chaos, supporting terrorist organizations like Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis rebels in Yemen. And one of the provisions of the deal is that not only lifting sanctions, foreign assets that were frozen were also released to them. In the case of the United States, it was rumored that we released matter of fact, you followed news at the time, the Obama administration during the night sent out an Air Force aircraft, a C-130. And it was in the news when it landed, pallets of money, was being given to the Iranian government. Now, it was reported that it was $170 billion, but it really wasn't $170 billion. It was about $50 to $60 billion. And it was really their money. It was money that they had negotiated a deal back in the 1990s timeframe to buy U.S. equipment. And because of the situation in Iran at the time, we didn't honor the deal, but they had already paid for it. So it was put in the bank, and all over those years, roughly, 20, 30 years, it was, it was receiving an interest rate for that. And I think the deal was a multi-billion-dollar arrangement. But the idea is that when that large bulk of assets, especially hard cash, was released to Iran, you would have thought that it would go into rebuilding the economy and providing a better quality of life for its people. And the big concern was that it wasn't being used for that purpose. It was being diverted to support Iran's, efforts to gain greater power within the region and also support the terrorist organizations that I mentioned.
So just a thought, do you think it was a wise move for Trump to withdraw from the Jcpoa?
Yes, for the reasons that I said. And the only way, short of going to war, is to use economic sanctions. And it probably would have worked if the other P5+1 countries went along. But they felt that something was better than nothing. they were looking, hey, geez, you know, we've got, it's 2018, we've got until 2031, you know, to kind of turn Iran around and get them, you know, to move away from their terrorist activities and their desire for a nuclear weapon. If you look at the history of Iran, I just didn't see that happening. So I don't think that it was a good decision. I think the decision that Trump made, you know, based on the information that he had available, because he made a decision. One of the things that influenced his decision is when he saw the results of the Israeli covert operation that produced something like 55,000 documents that showed that Iran was progressively pursuing a nuclear weapons program, which indicated that Iran was not only hiding it, but was lying about it because they were supposed to disclose that as part of the deal.
So I take it you're not in favor of rejoining the Jcpoa?
I think it's too late. I mean, you know.
I don't think it's going to happen. I mean,
Well, it's not going to happen. You can see, I mean, Biden has really been very earnest about trying to get the U.S. to rejoin. But with the accelerated approach that Iran has been using, they're at the point where they've got uranium enriched to 60%. It doesn't take a lot of effort to go from 60% to 90%. They already have the nuclear material to make one nuclear weapon. I am sure that the ballistic missile testing that they've been doing has a nuclear weapons capability. And there's concern that the ballistic testing that they're doing will have a long-range capability, which means it can reach outside the Middle East, and eventually could become an intercontinental ballistic capability, which means it could reach the United States.
But the result of pulling out of the agreement is Iran gets nuclear weapons sooner.
But the argument is that they were working towards it already. You know, even though they were in the deal, the IAE was running into problems in being able to inspect in a timely manner. Were restricted from some areas, and as you can see, in 2016, they found undeclared nuclear activity in 3 sites that weren't even on the list as far as where they were doing nuclear work. So I think it's just as in the case of North Korea. And they had, you know, a clandestine program that was gradually moving them down the road. I think at the time of the deal, they said that they were within a year of developing the nuclear material that they needed. They may not have been far enough along to develop it into a weapon and then harness it to a missile, but they were making progress along those lines. I think it's a judgment call. You know, the Obama administration and both the Biden administration felt that Iran could be trusted, and that we were better off trying to keep them in the deal than not. The Trump administration just didn't feel that same way. And you look at how it's unfolded, you know, now they are just, some estimates are that they're just within weeks of actually being able to build a bomb. Not only having the material, but, you know, building the bomb. And just because they build the bomb doesn't mean that they're going to be a threat tomorrow. They still got to take that bomb, miniaturize it to be able to put it into a missile, and then they have to have a missile that, you know, that'll carry it not only on a regional basis, but an intercontinental ballistic basis. You know, from my military perspective, I'm a retired Army officer. I spent 20 years in the military. I was in the Army. The last 6-7 years was in the Pentagon. I worked in the Chief of the Staff of the Army's office, and later I worked in the Star Wars program. So I have a lot of insights, and based on the way that it was going, you know, if their intention was not to develop a nuclear weapons program, the deal was a good deal. But you knew that behind the scenes, you just couldn't trust them. That's why the Congress didn't approve it. There was just not only Republicans, but Democrats as well, because they needed a 60 vote to be able to kill it. There was enough concern there that Iran could not be trusted, that they would not approve it. And that, again, is another Achilles heel, because when you don't have an agreement like that ratified by the Congress, which kind of turns it into a treaty, then that means when the next administration comes in, they don't have to go to Congress to overturn it. The next president can overturn it. That's what Trump did in the case of Obama, and that's what Biden did in the case of Trump. Whereas if they had, in fact, ratified it in the Congress, then a president couldn't overrule it. He'd have to go to Congress, get a vote on it. He could override the vote, but then it would go back to the Congress, and they could override the veto. So, you know, it's very, very important what's going on there. From my perspective, not so much about Iran developing Iran developing a nuclear weapons capability. It's the proliferation of that technology, you know, into the hands of terrorist organizations that are responsible to no one. You know, a country develops a nuclear weapons capability, then the international community can really put pressure to bear, you know, to try to contain it. You know, trying to do that now with, you know, with the situation in Ukraine. When a terrorist organization like Iran, like ISIS or Al-Qaeda gets it, you know, they have no trepidation at all of taking a nuclear weapon, put it into a suitcase, coming into a city like New York City, and instead of, you know, destroying the Twin Towers, of destroying the whole city. You know, that's the danger. And as far as it falling into the hands of Hamas and Hezbollah, which are basically supported through the funding that it gets from Iran, then you know that it's going to fall into their hands. And what are they going to do? They're going to try to blow Israel off the face of the earth. And Israel has never acknowledged or denied the fact that they have a nuclear weapon capability, but general consensus is, and if you look at any reports that are done, and I can show you one, for example, it is clear that they do in fact have a nuclear weapons capability, and indications are they were ready to use it during the 1973 war that they had with the Arab world, with Egypt. So if they, you know, if Hamas, Hezbollah gets that type of capability, if they use it, you know, or try to use it against Israel, Israel, without a doubt, will retaliate in kind. And I don't think they'll just go after Hezbollah in Hamas. They'll go after Iran. And that's where the big problem of nuclear weapons go, is that the little guys eventually draws in, you know, the big nuclear powers, because they start taking sides. You know, for example, in the Ukraine situation, if Russia does use a tactical nuclear weapon, and the United States decides to respond in kind, and then it starts to escalate, you know, that forces the other European countries, the UK, France, both nuclear powers, you know, to take sides. And where do you think China's going to go? You know, China is going to support, at least you would think, it would probably support Russia. And then there's the question, who is India going to support? They're kind of burning the candle at both ends. They're doing business with the U.S. and they're doing business with Russia. And that's where the real danger is. And that's what I see as the danger. I hope you found it informative. You know, again, I'll give a talk next month on Iran. I mean, not Iran, but Ukraine, which is also very, very interesting. That's a fast-moving train, but I think you may see it slow down come the winter months, because they're just not going to be able to fight in the cold weather conditions of Europe. And I've been in Europe, and when I was in the military, get involved in what was known at the time as reforgers, where the U.S. forces came to Europe for generally a 2 to 4 week period to conduct military operations. We did it in the spring and we did it in the winter. In the dead of winter in Europe, it is deadly cold. I would not want to fight a war in Europe in the winter months. Okay, thank you very much for coming.